Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at behaviourism, both hard or analytical behaviourism and the soft behaviourism advocated by Gilbert Ryle. Now these are not names that were actually put forward by the philosophers that argued for them, but they've become terms by which these two forms of behaviourism have become known. So let's first look at some key scholars. The key point summaries. Well, behaviourists deny the existence of the mind altogether. So our psychological concepts such as pain, fear, anxiety and so on merely describe behaviour. There is no inner life. Outer behaviour is all there is. So when we talk about pain and anxiety, all we're talking about are specific types of behaviour. We are not talking about someone's inner life of thoughts and feelings. And talk of mental states is just behavioural description. Now the key scholars you need to know here are Friedrich Waismann and Karl Hempel. They advocated the logical positivist hard behaviourism, and then the behaviourism of Gilbert Ryle, which is known as soft behaviourism. So, basic behaviourism is understood to be a practical consequence of the verification principle. I'm only able to make meaningful assertions about the behaviour of others if there is some way in which such assertions can be verified. It is not possible for me to either verify or falsify whether or not others have the same sensations that I do, or indeed have any sensations at all. Similarly, it is not possible just by looking at someone's brain state to establish whether or not they are in pain. If nothing else, think about the phenomenon of neuroplasticity and the multiple realizability problem. Thus, as I said at the start, behaviourism argues that the mind does not exist at all. Instead, all our psychological descriptions are merely descriptions of behaviour. To be angry is to shake one's fists and shout, for example. To be in pain is to wince and cry out, and so on. So, as I said at the start, basic analytical behaviourism can be understood as a practical consequence of the verification principle and logical positivism. And so, right now I'm going to look at a way in which logical positivists, specifically Friedrich Waismann and Karl Hempel, look at the application of mental state terms such as pain and so on. So Waismann and Hempel would argue that the proposition John has a headache actually means that John winces and weeps and makes specific gestures. When asked about the problem, John declares, "I have a headache." John's blood pressure and level of hydration show various changes that are concomitant with this behaviour. And that means they go with the behaviour. All of these things are related to John's physical constitution. Thus, all we are doing when we're applying the term headache is to describe specific forms of behaviour. We're not describing any qualitative experiences, for example, that John has, because according to the behaviourist, any application of psychological terms is purely based on behaviour, just describing particular sets of behaviour. So that is hard behaviourism summarised. Let's now look at Gilbert Ryle's soft behaviourism. As I say, this is not the term soft is not one that Ryle came up with himself. It's just become known as that because it's a little bit more flexible than what is known as analytical or hard behaviourism. So historically, Ryle's behaviourism preceded the development of identity theories of mind and functionalism. Indeed, these theories arose as forms of response to behaviourism. Haunted by Frege's observation that even an unphilosophical person soon finds it necessary to recognise an inner world distinct from the outer world, a world of sense impressions, feelings and moods, many philosophers felt the need to reinstate the mental into their accounts of the mind. Part, though by no means all of the reason for this, was that such philosophers considered that Ryle was trying to rid philosophical accounts of mind of any conception of the mental as distinct from behaviour. Now, certainly, Ryle is keen to dispose of the Cartesian immaterial mind. In one of the most frequently quoted passages from his work, The Concept of Mind, in the book The Concept of Mind, Ryle attacks the Cartesian conception of mind as the dogma of the ghost in the machine. And indeed, this version of behaviourism can indeed be seen as a criticism of Cartesian substance dualism. So the dissolution of Cartesian conceptions of mind was undeniably part of Ryle's project, but the question remained as to whether this left room for any dualistic kind of physicalism, that is, one which distinguishes between behaviour and brain states, for example. Now, Ryle wanted to show that the way to understand our psychological concepts correctly, and as such how they function, is rooted wholly in accurately describing the use of words in relation to observable behaviour. Only when one is clear about that can one be said to understand psychological concepts and how to apply them correctly. Unlike identity theorists and functionalists, Ryle was not interested in causal interactions between mind and body. He was, after all, trying to dissolve any kind of dualism. Rather, behaviour mattered only insofar as it allowed us to get clear, if you like, about the use of the concepts we employ to describe it. This naturally means that suggestions that the concept of pain is a brain state, or in some sense linked to sensory inputs, computational responses resulting in observable behaviour and so on, is superfluous, it's redundant. Indeed, all concepts which claim to describe our subjective experiences or in some other way refer to the inner mental events, such as pain and seeing, if you like your qualia, are, Ryle argued, only based on our observable behaviour. The reason we are likely to become confused on this count and suppose the existence of a private inner life, or at the very least a physicalist conception of mind that exists in some sort of causal relationship with the body, is that we have made and are labouring under the influence of a category mistake. Ryle argues that the mental and physical are not two separate things, but rather two different ways of characterising and describing beings with psychological capacities. He gives several examples to show what he means by a category mistake. A foreigner, he says, visiting Oxford or Cambridge for the first time is shown a number of colleges, libraries, playing fields, museums, scientific departments and administrative offices. He then asks, but where is the university? It then has to be explained to him that the university is not another collateral institution, some ulterior counterpart to the colleges, laboratories and offices which he has seen. The university is just the way in which all that he has already seen is organised. In this case, the tourist makes the mistake of believing the university to be a particular thing, as opposed to the ways in which libraries, laboratories, etc. are organised. And Ryle also argues, and says similarly, the mental and physical are not two separate things, but rather two different ways of characterising and describing things with psychological capacities. In another famous passage, he explains this as follows. Now, the dogma of the ghost in the machine does just this. It maintains that there exists both bodies and minds, that there occur physical processes and mental processes, that there are mechanical causes of corporeal movements and mental causes of corporeal movements. Those who continue to advocate forms of dualism, both Cartesian and brain-body, are in essence making the same mistake as the foreigner who thinks that the university is the same kind of thing as the colleges and laboratories which comprise it. They treat the mental as something of a similar category to the physical, but with certain differences, presumably like the differences between the administrative offices and science laboratories. Ryle's claim is that they should be treating the mental as a way of describing the ways in which our bodily movements and expressions are organised. Now, Ryle is not saying that there are no such things as mental processes. There need to be in order for us to behave at all and perform mental acts, such as calculation. He says in his book, I am not, for example, denying that there occur mental processes. Doing long division is a mental process, and so is making a joke. However, the idea of any form of fundamental inner-outer distinction, that is, the inner life of qualia and the outer life of the physical, was, as we've seen, rejected in favour of the idea that concepts such as pain only refer to kinds of observable behaviour. Seeing someone yell or cry out and clutching their finger after catching it in a closing door would, for example, provide good behavioural grounds for me to ascribe the concept of pain to them. My response to the predicament of this person would give a third party good reason to say that I believe this person to be in pain. There is nothing else that I could even in principle appeal to in this kind of case to substantiate the application of such psychological predicates. Thus, the idea of an inner, subjective experience in relation to such concepts is superfluous or redundant, and can be dissolved altogether. In other words, it can be considered as no more than a fiction, the ghost in the machine, if you like. So let's now look at some objections to behaviourism. Firstly, behaviourism fails to make a distinction between when someone is sincere and when someone is pretending. If our psychological adjectives rely on nothing more than behaviour, then there is no way to distinguish between someone who is genuinely in pain and someone who is pretending. Behaviourism leaves no room for qualia. If our psychological adjectives are informed solely by behaviour, then the nature of our experiences plays no part in their application. And so this seems to be false. Surely a major aspect of what it is to be in pain is what it feels like. Then, of course, there is the general circularity problem. This claims that the translation of mental states into behaviours contains the idea of mental states. For example, if Carl Hempel were to translate the mental state of being sad, he would talk about linguistic behaviour, like telling someone that they are upset. Thus, the very idea of anger, fear, sadness, and so on presupposes mental states. Thus, the behaviourist is arguing in a circle. So, John may display pain behaviour because he has a headache. However, he will only display pain behaviour because he thinks it will attract attention. However, he only wants to attract attention because he has a headache. Thus, the idea of a headache has a necessary link to other dimensions of John's inner mental life, and this is something the behaviourist denies. Okay, I hope that's given you some idea of behaviourism and some objections to it, and that's the end of this video.